In this part, we shall see about the parchment paper making and the Chinese paper making. Next in the list is making of parchment paper from animal hides or skins. Parchment is prepared from pelt, which is wet, unhaired, and limed skin. The animal skin is treated with calcium hydroxide or lime and dried at ordinary temperature. The hairs are then easy to scrape out. The inner flesh side of the skin is ratty and uneven with lingering fats. This side is scrubbed and scraped using a sharp semilunar knife by stretching the skin onto a wooden frame. The scraped and smoothened surface of the stretched skins are then dried for half a day to 4 weeks. The desired sizes of this sheet is then cut with a sharp knife. After cutting out the desired size of the parchment paper, it is further treated by rubbing with pumice powder while it is still stretched onto a wooden frame to make it smooth and appropriate enough to enable the ink to penetrate deeply. Alternately, powders and pastes containing calcium compounds are also used to rub to degrease the surface to prohibit the ink from running away. Also, thin pastes of starch grain or staunch grain, lime, flour, egg whites, and milk are applied onto the surface to obtain a cleaner, whiter, and shining surface. Parchment remains the only medium till today to make traditional Jewish texts, Torah scrolls, or tefillin or mezuzahs in Israel. For these traditional practices, the hides of only kosher animal are permitted according to the Jewish laws, and the entire process of making parchment is conducted under strict supervision of a qualified rabbi or a spiritual teacher. It is believed that the Moses wrote the first Torah scroll on an unsplit cow hide called zebel. Parchment is still popular in some universities to make certificate scrolls to be presented at the graduation ceremonies. The University of Notre Dame in Israel still uses animal parchment certificates for offering its diplomas. Similarly, Heriot-Watt University in England uses goat skin parchment for making their degrees and certificates of graduation. The modern parchment paper is now made by running sheets of paper pulp through a bath of sulfuric acid. The ink forms in different civilizations were unique and independently developed. The prehistoric times, ink was developed from soot and wood smoke and mixed with animal fat and gelatin. For writing on palm leaves, lamp black or coal powder mixed with a resinous oil was used as an ink. Lamp black was also used by Chinese, Egyptians, and Mesopotamians along with colored pigments, gums, saps, or glues to make ink. Today's ink sticks still follow the age-old method of making ink in China. The main problem with such inks are short lives or limited durability. Often the ink would fade away upon sunlight exposure. To overcome this problem, chemical ink or gall ink was developed during 8th to 11th century AD from tannic acid and iron salt bound by resin. Before the paper was invented, the ancient Chinese used to write on silk, wood, bamboo stripes, but the silk was an expensive material, and wood and bamboo scrolls were too heavy to carry. Later on, paper making technique was invented. Chinese used a number of materials for making paper, which include tree bark, rice, hemp, fruit peel fibers, grass, grain husk, bamboo, straw, seaweed, fish net, rags, natural fibers, and so on. During 1st century BC in Han Dynasty, Kai Lin brought an improved method which is still a standard method today for making traditional papers. The paper became very popular as it was light and durable. Writing was much easier and the material was much cheaper so as to reach among common people. Soon it spread to Korea, Japan, Vietnam, etc. During 4th to 6th century AD, it entered in India via Chinese, Tibet and Vietnamese travelers. It spread to Arabian countries and Europe during 7th to 15th century AD. By 19th century, it spread all across the globe. The main steps in paper making are shown here. The plant fibers are collected, chopped and soaked in water. The soaked content is then beaten and made slurry in a water tank. The slurry is strained through a fine screen and the fibers are randomly interwoven to make a fine surface. The sheet is dried and removed and then further dried to obtain a paper sheet. Here we shall see two different raw materials for generating paper. First is rice straw and Vincellus bark and the second is mulberry bark. The straw is collected after the harvest and steamed and boiled and then taken to the slopes of the hills to spread on for drying. The spread is left for almost 6 months, during which the rains and sunlight smoothen the fibers along with natural bleaching. The dried and bleached straw is then hulled under huge wooden blocks. The Vincellus bark is also treated similarly. The straws are pounded into fine powdery mass, which is then mixed with water and trampled. The consistency is then transferred to a tank filled with water for washing. A fine screen net is then hung and adjusted on the top of the tank and moved back and forth to collect and spread a fine suspension of fibers from the slurry. The screen is then lifted aside so as to drain the water, leaving behind a layer of randomly interwoven fibers. The thin smear of fibers is then removed from the screen and spread over a dry cloth. The layers are then squeezed to drain out the excess water and dressed up. This step provides uniformity and integrity to the product. The sufficiently squeezed and dried layers are then taken for sun drying. Sometimes sand rubbing is employed to obtain a finer finish. The fine paper sheet is now ready for use, that is calligraphy, painting, writing, packing, and making handicrafts. The second material is mulberry bark. The bark is cut and peeled. The layers of the bark peels are again peeled off to remove the darker outer thin layers with a sharp knife. After peeling, the stripes are hanged for drying and then soaked in water for 10 days. The soaked stripes are now fully soft and fluffy as the cellulose have become loosened. The stripes are then dipped in water with plant ashes and boiled for 15 hours. The stripes are now taken out of the boiling pot. These are now scrubbed clean to remove any lumps or knots. The cleaned bark stripes are then beaten, chopped and pounded to obtain a fine pulp. The pulp is then spread in the water tank and a fine suspension is created. The slurry is then collected over a fine screen net and water is strained out. The layer of paper is then separated from the screen and further squeezed to drain out the water. The another method, it can be left on the screen and directly taken for drying in the sun or hot air produced from the fire. Upon drying, the surface can be further smoothened by rubbing with a sandstone. The paper is now ready for use. The traditional mulberry paper is very durable and known to have survived for almost 1000 years. These are often applied on the doors and windows of traditional houses as a curtain material as light could pass through. Apart from usage as a writing surface, the traditional paper is used for making traditional lamps, dolls and dummies for exhibition, boxes, traditional hand fans and packaging materials. Now we shall continue to part 7 of this lecture.